1914 was a quiet month at the Berry schools, sitting peacefully in the Appalachian foothills of northwest Georgia, in a state that still had one foot in the horse and buggy age and was overwhelmingly isolationist in international affairs. Not much happened in that fateful month of June that concerned the citizens of Georgia or the students of Berry, even the assassination that changed the world. The assassination of Austro-Hungarian Archduke Franz Ferdinand in Sarajevo, Bosnia, on June 28, 1914, barely made the news in Georgia. But it was a much different story for Martha Berry, founder of the Berry Schools, who was in Italy visiting her sister at the time of the assassination. When the news was announced, she and those around her had no suspicion that war would result from the event. But it wouldn't be long before war came nonetheless, like a clap of thunder from a clear sky. Martha, who was in Austria-Hungary when the war was declared, was ready to return to Georgia, and she soon realized that this would be no easy task, as the entirety of Europe had begun preparations for a fight. As she attempted to travel home, the journey across the continent that usually took a matter of hours took 6 days. Yet at long last, after a long trip across the ocean in a cramped steamship, she eventually set eyes on New York Harbor, eager to get back to her work and to see her students, but unaware that the war would soon follow her to American shores. Over the next 3 years, war engulfed most of the European continent. By 1917, people were calling it the Great War, and it was a conflict in which the U.S. could no longer stay neutral. Germany's threatening presence on the sea and President Woodrow Wilson's desires to protect democracy in Europe, among other factors, led to America's involvement in the war that would be known as World War I. Following the declaration of war, the Selective Service Act drafted many Americans to help build a large enough army to make an impact on the Great War. Because some rural areas needed men on farms, the government had trouble enlisting soldiers from these areas, and the Wilson administration threatened local officials in rural Georgia with criminal prosecution for refusing to carry out provisions of the Selective Service Act. In the end, 80,000 Georgians were drafted or volunteered, and the state began to exhibit a growing sense of nationalism. The Berry School for Boys had opened in 1902, and the School for Girls in 1909, meaning that in 1917, Berry was still a very young institution. And in the 1916-1917 school year, there were 100 high schoolers enrolled in the boys' school and 164 enrolled in the girls' school. By the end of the war, some 500 Berry students and alumni would end up serving in uniform. Most military recruits from Berry hailed from rural areas, and their education at the Berry schools helped prepare them for military life. Berry boys could read and write and had spent years completing tasks similar to the ones asked of them in Army training. Many wrote back to thank the schools for the experience they had gained. One such letter from camp read,
"I never realized just what the Berry School had done for me until I came to camp. It hurts some of the fellas to sleep out on the drill field and rise at 5 a.m., but I don't mind a bit. Everything I've gotten at Berry has proven beneficial to me, such as sweeping, cooking, making beds, and washing. It would tickle you to see some of these New York fellas getting into the game. They can hardly stand it."
On the home front, students and faculty at Berry did what they could to help with the war effort, both within the school and beyond its borders. The boys traveled to different parts of the U.S. to build Army cantonments, using the training in building and construction they received at the Berry schools. The girls knit sweaters for the soldiers at the front, and one Berry boy wrote back,
"When I think how you girls sacrificed your time knitting for us boys in the Army, I'm inclined to believe that somebody is interested in our welfare. We're much more thankful for the sweaters just because they're made by the hands of our own schoolmates."
While patriotism swelled, the Berry schools' financial situation deteriorated. Faculty and class sizes decreased because so many male students and teachers were enlisted or were drafted. President Wilson and the U.S. Commissioner of Education, P.P. Claxton, urged younger men not to enlist in the military, but to go to school to serve the country, because the U.S. needed educated men to help rebuild after the war. The Berry schools created advertisements to remind prospective students that for the U.S. to be successful after the war, Americans needed the kind of a training and education that Berry offered. Other ads emphasized that going to school was as important as military service. Though the Berry schools tried to retain as many students as possible, they couldn't prevent everyone from enlisting. And though Berry had prepared the men for life in the barracks, nothing the Berry school could teach them would prepare them for life and death on the battlefield. In September of 1918, U.S. officers drove their soldiers to the breaking point in the Meuse-Argonne offense, which was the final push of American forces in an all-out attack utilizing advanced tactics to defeat the Germans once and for all. The Meuse-Argonne offense was the largest military engagement in U.S. history, not surpassed until the Normandy invasion 26 years later. Although U.S. General John J. Pershing planned the campaign as a show of tactical finesse, poor training, and difficult terrain, turned it into a series of half-coordinated frontal assaults that smothered the German defenders under the weight of dead American bodies. Among them, Walter Levy, who had graduated from the Berry School for Boys in 1909. Levy was a young man who had stood out at home and abroad. His accomplishments at Berry marked him as an individual capable of so much. Levy had been a prominent athlete at Berry, worked with the Debating Society, and was a campus leader. Recognitions of his abilities continued in the military, and he was promoted to first lieutenant before his division left for France. Though Levy's life ended during the war, his legacy continued and is now immortalized on a plaque with 10 others who died during World War I. William Humphreys, William Littleton, Martin D. Seal, Ulysses Kent, Ernest Reeves, Cloud Horton, W. L. Weir, Jesse Ash, John Montgomery, and Andrew Carney. Andrew Carney died on November 11, 1918, making him one of the last Americans to be killed in the conflict. John Montgomery was another casualty, who was one of the first Americans to set foot on foreign soil during the war. While at Berry, it is believed that Montgomery worked with the poultry. Montgomery then joined the Marines before the U.S. even declared war, and he stayed in regular contact with the school by sending letters home. In one of those letters, he wrote,
"I am away from home and friends, but have not forgotten them. I am serving my country, which I believe all true Americans should. I may not return to those I love, but if I get killed, I died like an American should, doing my duty to my country and my God."
Shot on the lakes during the Battle of Blue Woods on June 6, 1918, Montgomery was sent to the American Expeditionary Forces Base Hospital in Paris. He wrote home of his hope to walk again within weeks, if not days, but his condition worsened, and Montgomery died on August 5, 1918. It was a sign of the times that not every Berry student or alumni who died in the conflict was killed overseas in battle. Some died of disease while at training camp in the U.S. Ulysses Kent, who was the first Berry boy in uniform to die during the war, passed away on Christmas Day, 1917, of illness at Camp Pike in Little Rock, Arkansas, having only been in the service for 21 days. Martin Seal, Ernest Reeves, and Jesse Ash also died in American camps of diseases. When older boys did leave Berry for the military, they left spots open for younger boys to enroll. While this helped stabilize the student population, younger boys required more training and schooling, which increased costs. Another challenge was replacing faculty. So many teachers served in the military during the war that those who stayed had to serve double duty, as Martha Berry wrote to one friend.
"I'm having a hard time keeping the people we have here at Berry who have any training. I'm feeling this war crisis and am working day and night trying to hold the school together."
She pleaded with others to come and teach, including Alice Wingo, to whom she wrote that,
"So many of our men have been called to the war that it is almost impossible to find teachers to fill their places."
S.H. Cook was one such teacher who was drafted into the military. Cook had held several positions at the Berry schools, including mathematics teacher, physical director, and a head of the student YMCA work. Then Cook was lost to the draft. Determined to keep him, Martha Berry wrote to the U.S. Secretary of Treasury, William McAdoo, asking for a draft exemption for Cook. McAdoo responded after speaking to the Secretary of War and Colonel Hugh S. Johnson, but the response Berry received left her without satisfaction.
The facts as stated by Miss Berry undoubtedly make out a very strong case of the necessity to the school of the retention of the services of the teacher S.H. Cook. But there is no authority whatever in the Selective Service Law or regulations for granting exemption or deferred classification to a teacher or to a director of physical training.
Martha Berry later wrote to Cook directly, asking him to take a leave of absence from the military so that he could teach for a few days at the beginning of the school year. Cook answered that he could not. The girls of the Berry schools, like women across the U.S., got involved in the war by doing things such as volunteering to roll bandages for the Red Cross or by raising money. Others went to Europe as nurses, and some 11,000 American women served abroad in all. One such nurse was Mildred Street, who had attended the Berry schools and went to work for the YMCA. She was first stationed in Paris and then in Italy, where she became the first American woman to work for Italian soldiers. She later reported,
"I had the opportunity to see a good many hundred of the wounded men after the big fighting. The first night I went down to the station, 800 of these men, many of them were mere boys, came in. They were light cases, and with but a few exceptions were able to walk. We gave hard candy, American chocolate, and cigarettes to all except the head cases who were not allowed to smoke."
Back on the home front, the Berry girls also pooled their money together and raised $62 to buy a Liberty Bond. The extra money went towards buying a new bell for the school chapel. By April 1918, the students and faculty had collected $1,000, to which the Berry schools added another $3,000 for Liberty Bonds. But the U.S. needed more than just bonds, buildings, and clothing to execute the war successfully. The country also needed people across the U.S. to produce more food. If Americans spent less on these resources, it gave them the opportunity to invest more in the war. Students at the Berry schools cultivated the land, cared for gardens, milked their own cows, and sold Duroc pigs, and inspired others to participate in home production. In an address to the school, Martha Berry spoke of the importance of teamwork.
This world war has made us all realize that we must work together. Teamwork on the farm will give us more and better to eat and help win the war.
Such contributions of time, energy, money, and skills represented a dramatic shift from the isolationism that prevailed just months earlier. Fundraising for the schools was another challenge posed by the war, because regular and new donors who might otherwise have sent money to the Berry schools now diverted their funds to support the war effort. At the same time, there was a growing sense that educated young men and women would indeed be needed for the rebuilding of American culture post-war, which only increased the importance of keeping the doors open. Martha Berry struggled to make her usual trips around the country to secure donors, relying more on letters and advertisements to secure funding support. During the war, Martha Berry used advertisements that likened donating to the schools to Liberty Bonds, the hope being that people would be persuaded to divert money that might have gone to the war effort to go to Berry instead. These advertisements had slogans such as,
"With the help of your Liberty Bonds, victory is certain for Berry in the fight against illiteracy and inefficiency."
Some Berry boys were honored for their actions in battle. Harry Atkinson received the Croix de Guerre for helping stop the German advance on Paris in spring of 1918. Maurice Andrews was also awarded with the Croix de Guerre, with one officer writing,
"By his coolness and self-sacrifice, he saved the lives of many men and has the respect and admiration of all concerned. The enemy having crossed the Marne, this officer volunteered to lead patrols into the enemy lines to ascertain the enemy's strength. He also carried messages through barrage of fire time and again when others failed."
On November 11, 1918, at 11 a.m., the Great War came to an end. Whether they died in battle or elsewhere, or whether they survived the war with honors and medals, sources suggest that the Berry boys were willing to sacrifice their life in defense of the U.S., all while remembering the school from whence they came. After the war, Berry used advertisements to remind people how much students sacrificed, in a tactic to boost donations. To keep up the fundraising, Martha Berry cast support of the Berry schools as patriotic, connecting the fate of the schools with the fate of a nation engaged in a struggle for the future. On a worldwide scale, more than 9 million soldiers had been killed and another 21 million wounded by the time the fighting ended. 116,516 American soldiers were dead, among them 1,589 Georgians, including 11 Berry boys. Though they had lost a number of their own, the Berry schools greeted the war's end with joy, celebrating Peace Day in late November with marches, speeches, and songs.
Bells rang and the bugles blew. Gladness was let loose at both schools.
Students lined up in front of the new memorial chapel to listen to Germany's acceptance of the armistice terms, before the celebration moved to Oak Hill, where Martha Berry gave a speech amidst more singing and rejoicing. The day ended with a huge bonfire, and just a few days later, the Berry schools celebrated a second Peace Day. The Berry schools built several monuments after the war in remembrance of the 11 Berry boys who had lost their lives, including Victory Lake, the Road of Remembrance, and the plaque bearing the names of the 11 men in the college chapel. After the war, many of the young men who left Berry to serve their country during the war returned to their education. 11 Berry boys never got the opportunity to come back home.
They sleep today wrapped in the stars and stripes for which they gave their fresh young lives. For others, the long, long trail is a winding homeward and to Berry.